Of the more than 21,000 American soldiers who would cross Utah Beach on June 6th, 1,944, only one of them was a 56-year-old man walking with a cane. He was also the only general in the entire invasion to come ashore with the very first wave of troops against the direct wishes of doctors who had warned him that his heart could not survive it. As the ramp of his landing craft slams down into the surf, machine gun fire cutting across the water in front of him, General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr. does not yet know the single most important fact of his morning. The current has carried his men and his ships more than a mile off course. Somewhere ahead of him, hidden behind smoke and sand dunes that do not match his map, an entire invasion is about to be decided by what he does in the next 60 seconds. The men storming ashore that morning did not know his name yet. They only knew that somewhere ahead of them, moving through gunfire that killed younger, faster, healthier soldiers with every step, was an old man leaning on a cane who refused to take cover. To understand why Theodore Roosevelt, Jr. was on that beach at all, you have to understand what kind of man spends his entire life trying to prove he still belongs in the fight. He was born into expectation. His father had charged up a hill in Cuba and become President of the United States. His father had hunted lions in Africa and negotiated the end of a war between empires. Growing up as the namesake of a man like that meant every room Theodore Roosevelt, Jr. ever walked into was already comparing him to someone else. He spent most of his adult life trying not to be measured against a ghost, and mostly failing, because the comparison followed him everywhere. Wall Street, Washington, the battlefield. When the United States entered the First World War, Roosevelt was working in finance, comfortable, safe, exactly the kind of life a man of his standing was expected to protect. He left it immediately. He crossed the Atlantic as an infantry officer with the 1st Infantry Division, and was gassed in the trenches badly enough that doctors feared for his lungs for the rest of his life. He was shot in the leg at a place called Soissons, a wound that never fully healed, and that would leave him limping for the next 26 years. He refused to be evacuated from the front lines longer than the army insisted, and came home from that war decorated for gallantry under fire, a young officer who had already proven, at considerable personal cost, that his last name was not the only thing he had inherited from his father. Other officers who came from money used their connections to move to safer postings. Roosevelt used his connections to stay exactly where the fighting was. That pattern would define the rest of his life. Whenever a door opened that led somewhere comfortable, he found a way to slam it shut. When the war ended, he was part of a small group of returning officers who gathered in Paris to found a new organization for veterans, men who had nothing left but each other, and a government that seemed eager to move on without them. That organization would become the American Legion. When the men in it wanted to make him their first national commander, a position that could have launched him toward the very presidency his father once held, he turned it down. He argued that the organization could not survive being seen as one man's personal vehicle, that it needed to belong to every soldier equally, or it would belong to none of them. It was, by any measure, the single most politically advantageous decision he could have refused in his lifetime, and he refused it anyway. He tried the version of life that was expected of a man of his name after that. He worked in banking. He spent time as an editor and publishing executive in New York, the kind of comfortable, respectable position a war hero with his last name could have coasted through for decades. It never held him for long. He served as Assistant Secretary of the Navy. He served as Governor of Puerto Rico. He served as Governor General of the Philippines. Each posting took him further from Washington and further from comfort, into places most men of his class only visited on vacation. Colleagues who worked with him overseas remembered a man who could not sit still, who walked the streets of Manila and San Juan the way other governors stayed behind desks, who seemed almost allergic to the idea of being safe while other people were not. By the time the Second World War began, Theodore Roosevelt Jr. was already deep into the years most men spend planning for retirement. He had a heart condition serious enough that doctors had explicitly warned him against physical exertion. He had arthritis in his hips and knees so severe that he needed a cane simply to cross a room. On paper, there was no version of the United States Army that had any use for a man like that in combat. He asked to go anyway. He served in North Africa. He served in Sicily. Commanders who worked alongside him during those campaigns noticed something unusual. He did not lead from a headquarters tent studying maps. He walked among the infantry, ate what they ate, slept where they slept, and made a point of being visible under fire, not because he enjoyed danger, but because he believed a general who shared the risk earned something that could never be ordered into existence: trust. By early 1944, Roosevelt held the rank of Brigadier General and had been appointed Assistant Division Commander of the 4th Infantry Division, serving directly under Major General Raymond Barton, a career officer nearly the same age, a man everyone in the division called Tubby, a nickname that had followed him affectionately since his days at West Point. Barton respected Roosevelt. He also worried about him constantly. The 4th Infantry Division had been selected to lead the amphibious assault on a stretch of French coastline the planners had code named Utah. The choice of where to strike at all had consumed Allied planners for nearly 2 years, ever since a raid on the French port of Dieppe in August of 1942 had gone catastrophically wrong. About 6,000 troops took part, nearly 5,000 of them Canadian, in what was meant to be a large-scale test of German coastal defences. Within hours, the survivors were withdrawing in disarray, more than 900 Canadians killed and close to 2,000 more taken prisoner, with additional British and American losses. Dieppe taught the Allies, at brutal cost, exactly what storming a heavily defended stretch of French coastline could look like if it went wrong, and it shaped every decision that followed. The obvious place to invade was the Pas de Calais, where the English Channel narrowed to its shortest crossing and Allied fighter planes could provide cover from bases only minutes away. The Germans understood this too, and had packed the region with some of their strongest fortifications and most capable troops. Hitting Calais head-on, even successfully, promised a bloodbath. It was a British staff officer, Lieutenant General Frederick Morgan, tasked with finding an alternative, who concluded after months of study that a wider, less obvious stretch of coastline further west, in Normandy, offered a genuine, if narrow, chance of success. His recommendation became the foundation of the entire operation. Utah would be the westernmost beach of that plan, the anchor point for everything that followed, and Roosevelt wanted to be there for the first wave. He asked Barton directly. Barton said no. The risk was too great, the physical toll too obvious, and there was a hard military logic behind the refusal that had nothing to do with sentiment. Division commanders and their deputies were not supposed to be in the same landing craft, on the same beach, on the same morning. If a German shell found that boat, the 4th Infantry Division would lose its entire senior leadership in a single explosion before a single objective had been captured. It was not caution born of affection. It was caution born of arithmetic. Roosevelt asked again. Barton refused again. So Roosevelt put it in writing. He drafted a formal request, laying out the case not as a personal favour, but as a tactical argument. He believed that the presence of a general officer directly on the beach during the chaos of the first assault, someone with the rank and the standing to make immediate decisions without waiting for orders to travel back through the chain of command, could be the difference between a beachhead that held and one that collapsed under confusion. He wrote that the speed and coordination of the first men ashore might determine whether the entire operation succeeded or failed, and that he believed his presence there could contribute directly to that outcome. Barton read it and still said no. Roosevelt asked a third time. Whatever finally changed Barton's mind, whether it was the strength of the argument or simple exhaustion at being asked a third time by a man who was clearly not going to stop asking, he relented. The request never had to travel further than Barton's own desk. It was Barton himself, as division commander, who carried the authority to grant it, and it was Barton who finally decided that a man in his sixth decade, carrying a documented heart condition, would be permitted to risk everything in the opening minutes of the largest amphibious invasion in human history. Barton granted it. What almost none of the men preparing to follow Roosevelt onto that beach knew was the private conversation happening behind those written requests. Barton had confided to people close to him that he feared Roosevelt might not survive the landing at all, invasion or no invasion, simply from the physical strain of it. He said it not as an exaggeration, but as a real medical concern from a man who had watched his friend's health decline for years. Approving the request meant, in Barton's mind, that there was a real chance he was signing off on watching his oldest friend in the division die on a beach in France. Roosevelt knew this too. He never spoke of it publicly. He simply continued preparing as though the outcome had already been decided in his favor, because for him it had been decided years earlier, somewhere in a trench in 1918, long before anyone in the 4th Infantry Division had ever heard his name. While Roosevelt was writing his third request several hundred miles away, a very different kind of decision was being made by the man responsible for stopping him. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had spent the better part of a year turning the coastline of northern France into what Berlin proudly called the Atlantic Wall. He was 52 years old, already a legend, before he ever set foot in Normandy, the commander whose tank columns had chased British forces across the deserts of North Africa with a speed that earned him the nickname the Desert Fox, even from the men who feared him. He understood offence instinctively. Defence was a different discipline entirely, and Rommel had thrown himself into it with the same restless energy that defined his career, personally inspecting beaches, ordering millions of mines laid into French sand, driving iron obstacles and mined stakes into the tidal flats where landing craft would have to pass, insisting that the invasion, whenever it came, had to be destroyed in the water within the first hours or not at all. He believed the first day would decide the entire war in the West. He had said as much to his own staff only weeks earlier while walking a beach not far from where Roosevelt would eventually come ashore. The war would be won or lost in those hours, he told them. There would be no second chance to stop the enemy. Working against Rommel invisibly was an operation the Germans did not know existed. For months, Allied intelligence officers had been feeding false information into every channel the Germans trusted. Dummy tanks, built of rubber and wood, positioned across the English countryside, where German reconnaissance planes would photograph them. Fabricated radio traffic describing an entire Phantom Army group gathering opposite Calais, the narrowest and most obvious crossing point on the Channel. It worked well enough that Adolf Hitler himself remained convinced Normandy, whenever it was tested, would prove to be a diversion, a smaller strike meant to draw German reserves away from the real invasion, still to come at Calais. That belief would outlive the invasion itself by weeks, and it would cost the German army every hour it needed most, on the morning it needed them. For nearly 7 weeks after the landings, an entire German army, the 15th, would remain dug in around Calais, waiting for a second invasion that would never come, held in place by the same phantom force of rubber tanks and false radio traffic that had worked so well the night before. Only a fraction of the German soldiers stationed in France that summer would ever fight in Normandy at all. The date of the invasion itself had almost not been the 6th of June at all. The original plan called for the landings to launch a full day earlier, on the 5th, but by the 4th, the weather over the Channel had turned violent. High winds and heavy seas, capable of swamping landing craft and grounding the aircraft carrying the paratroopers before they ever reached France. At 4 in the morning on the 4th, Eisenhower gathered his senior commanders at a country house in southern England to hear from a lean, quietly spoken Royal Air Force officer named Group Captain James Stagg, the man responsible for predicting what the weather over Normandy would do in the days ahead. Stagg told a room full of men far senior to him in rank that the invasion needed to be delayed. Some of the officers present wanted to proceed regardless, aware that the exact combination of moon and tide the plan required would not occur again for weeks. American forecasters, working from different data, believed the weather would clear in time to land on the 5th after all. Stagg held his position. Eisenhower, carrying alone the weight of a decision that could either save or doom the entire operation, chose to trust him and ordered the invasion delayed 24 hours. It was the right call. The storm that battered the Channel through that night would have made the 5th impossible. Behind it, a narrow, fragile window of clearer weather was moving in, just wide enough to launch through on the 6th. It was exactly the kind of window German meteorologists, working with less complete data, failed to see coming. To Rommel, and to almost every senior German commander along the coast, an Allied landing in weather this poor seemed nearly impossible. Convinced there was no danger, for at least several more days, Rommel made the short trip home to Germany. His wife's 50th birthday fell on June the 6th, and he intended to be there for it. He also planned to use the visit to press Hitler personally for something he had wanted for months: direct control over the armored reserves that could crush an invasion the moment it hit the sand. Reserves Hitler had stubbornly kept under his own command instead. Rommel left his headquarters at the Château de la Roche-Guyon, confident he would be back within days, in plenty of time for whatever the Allies eventually attempted. He was not the only senior officer absent that week. Commanders of the German 7th Army, the force directly responsible for defending Normandy, had been ordered to a wargaming exercise scheduled for the following days in the town of Rennes, well inland, far from the coast they were supposed to be watching. The exercise was designed to rehearse exactly the kind of scenario that was, at that very moment, being loaded onto ships and aircraft across the English Channel. Several of the officers who understood the coastal defences best were, by pure administrative timing, about to be nowhere near them. It meant that, in the earliest hours of the invasion, when speed of decision would matter more than at almost any other point in the entire war, a significant portion of the German command structure responsible for Normandy would be scattered, distracted, or simply absent. Along the stretch of coastline the Allies had named Utah, defense fell to a division that reflected exactly how thin German resources had become by the summer of 1944. The 709th Static Infantry Division was commanded by Lieutenant General Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben, a 49-year-old career officer who had spent years fighting on the Eastern Front, including command of an armored division that had been effectively destroyed in the catastrophic fighting around Kursk the previous year. After that defeat, Schlieben had been reassigned west, given command of a division that existed, on paper, to guard a quiet stretch of French coast that German High Command still believed was a secondary concern compared to Calais. His men were not the hardened veterans of the Eastern Front he once commanded. Years of the war grinding through Russia had stripped Germany's best soldiers away from coastal duty and sent them east, leaving divisions like the 709th filled instead with older reservists, men considered too old or medically unfit for front-line combat elsewhere, and entire battalions made up of conscripted soldiers from Eastern Europe, many of them former Soviet prisoners of war who had been given a stark choice between fighting for Germany or suffering in a prison camp. These men wore German uniforms and stood in German trenches, but their loyalty to the cause defending that stretch of French sand was, for obvious reasons, questionable at best. Schlieben knew his division was not built for the kind of assault Rommel had warned about. He knew his men were spread thin across miles of coastline. That included not just the beach itself, but the flooded farmland and river crossings further inland. And on the night the invasion finally came, he would be trying to hold that line with his most experienced superior officer absent in Germany, and several of the division commanders who understood the regional defense plan best already on the road toward Rennes for that war game, out of easy reach of their own commands at the exact hour they were needed most. Neither Roosevelt nor Schlieben yet knew the other's name, but by the final hours of June the 5th, both of their fates had already been set in motion by decisions made days and weeks earlier, decisions about who would be present and who would be absent, who would insist on being exactly where the danger was, and who would be caught, through no real fault of his own, exactly where it wasn't. Across southern England that evening, the invisible machinery of Operation Neptune finally began to move. 20 harbours packed with men and equipment for months began emptying into the channel. Truck after truck rolled down to the docks. Soldiers who had trained for this moment for over a year climbed aboard ships with names painted in fresh white letters, carrying rifles they had cleaned obsessively, and letters home they hoped would not need to be delivered by someone else. At airfields scattered across the English countryside, thousands of paratroopers checked their equipment one final time. Before they boarded, many of them had been handed a printed message from General Eisenhower himself, warning them plainly that the enemy waiting across the channel was well trained, well equipped, and would fight savagely, and telling them he had full confidence in their courage and their skill. Then the aircraft doors closed, and the first of them lifted into the darkness over France, hours before the first landing craft would ever touch sand. Somewhere among the men boarding those ships bound for a beach called Utah was a brigadier general with a walking stick in one hand, moving with the same stubborn refusal to be left behind that had defined every major decision of his life. He did not know yet that the currents of the English Channel were about to conspire with the tides in a way no planner had accounted for. He did not know that within hours the map in his jacket pocket would become almost useless. He only knew that after 3 written requests and a lifetime spent trying to prove he belonged wherever the danger was greatest, he was finally getting exactly what he had asked for. Neither he nor the tired, understrength division waiting for him on the other side of that water yet understood how much of what happened in the next 24 hours would be decided not by the plans either side had drawn up so carefully in the months before, but by the empty chairs left behind that night, on both sides of the channel, by the men who were supposed to be there and were not. Out in the channel, in the hour before the sky turned grey, the sea itself seemed to be preparing for war. Warships that had spent the crossing in silence now opened up all at once, a wall of naval gunfire rolling toward the coast of France, shaking the water under every landing craft still circling offshore. Men who had never heard anything louder than a thunderstorm felt the concussion of 16-inch shells pass overhead and understood, for the first time, the true size of what they had volunteered for. Ahead of them, hidden somewhere behind smoke and spray, was a stretch of French coastline the planners had given a name almost absurd in its plainness: Utah. 11 miles of sand, the westernmost edge of the entire invasion, chosen not because it was easy, but because it was necessary, the only reasonable place to put men ashore close enough to eventually choke off the port city of Cherbourg, 35 miles to the north. Without a working deep-water port, the entire invasion would be forced to survive on whatever could be dragged across open beaches, a method that could sustain an army for weeks, but never one large enough to liberate a continent. Cherbourg was the nearest harbour capable of solving that problem, and that fact alone was the reason Utah Beach existed on the invasion plan at all. Duplex drive tanks, strange amphibious machines wrapped in canvas flotation screens, dropped into the water and began churning toward the beach ahead of the infantry. Engines straining, crews praying the fragile canvas walls holding back the sea would survive contact with the surf. Not far to the east, at a beach called Omaha, this same experiment would end in catastrophe. Tanks swallowed by the channel before they ever reached the sand. Here, calmer water and a control officer's decision to carry the tanks in closer before releasing them into the sea meant that most of the machines would make it, rising out of the surf onto the sand at almost the same moment as the infantry, a sight that would do as much to break the will of the defenders as any weapon fired that morning. Inside one of the landing craft pushing toward the coast, packed shoulder to shoulder with men from the 8th Infantry Regiment, stood Brigadier General Theodore Roosevelt, Jr., gripping his walking stick in one hand and a pistol in the other, watching the same grey coastline. Everyone else was watching, except he alone among them understood exactly how much authority rested on his shoulders that morning, and exactly how much his own body might refuse to cooperate with what he was about to ask of it. He had spent the crossing the way he spent most crossings, moving among the younger men instead of standing apart from them. Soldiers half his age remembered him quoting lines of poetry to calm nerves that had nothing left to hold on to, cracking jokes about seasickness, refusing to let anyone around him see fear reflected back at them from a general's face. It was a performance built from decades of practice, the same instinct that had carried him through the trenches of the First War. Whatever terror lived inside him that morning, he had long ago learned how to keep it from showing. What none of the coxswains steering those landing craft could see, and what none of the planners back in England could have accounted for, was the current running beneath the surface of the water. It was strong that morning, stronger than expected, pulling every boat in the flotilla steadily south along the coastline as they approached. Invisible, silent, patient. Smoke from the naval bombardment drifted across the beach and blotted out the landmarks the coxswains were using to navigate. One by one, without any of them fully realizing it was happening, the boats carrying the first wave of the 8th Infantry Regiment drifted further and further from where the maps said they were supposed to be. The ramps came down at 6:30 in the morning. Ahead of the men waiting to step off, lay the same defences Rommel had spent a year building along this entire coastline. Steel obstacles angled toward the sea, some tipped with mines, driven into the sand to rip open the hulls of landing craft at high tide. Wooden stakes, some also mined, planted in rows along the beach to break up any orderly advance. Belts of barbed wire strung behind them, and beyond that, a scattering of concrete strongpoints built to sweep the open sand with interlocking fields of fire. It was the same design being tested, at that very hour, along every beach the Allies were assaulting that morning, and on most of them it would extract a terrible price. Here, for reasons no one on either side of the water yet understood, it would not. Roosevelt was among the first men off his boat, wading into water that came up past his knees, the cold immediate and shocking even through the adrenaline. Machine gun fire cracked somewhere ahead, less of it than the men had braced for during months of training, but enough to kill, enough to make every man around him instinctively hunch his shoulders, as though that alone might turn aside a bullet. Roosevelt did not hunch. He straightened, planted his walking stick in the wet sand, and began moving forward as though the beach in front of him were simply the next room in a house he already knew. It took only a few minutes for the wrongness of the landscape to register. The dunes ahead did not match anything in the maps and photographs the officers had spent weeks memorizing. The landmark structures they had been told to expect were not there. Roosevelt sent a small reconnaissance party forward, while artillery rounds from a single well-dug-in German gun continued to fall around them, and within minutes the picture became clear. The current had done exactly what no one had predicted. It had carried the entire first wave more than a mile south of their intended landing zone, dropping them onto a completely different stretch of the beach than the 3 months of planning had prepared them for. Colonel James Van Fleet, commanding the 8th Infantry Regiment, found Roosevelt on the sand within minutes of the landing, both men trying to reconcile the ground in front of them with the maps in their hands. For a junior officer, a mistake of this size might have meant paralysis, a frantic scramble to correct course, boats turning back out to sea to search for the correct landing point, while the tide and the enemy both continued their work. Roosevelt did not have that luxury of hesitation in him. He studied the terrain with the same eye he had trained in North Africa and Sicily, and made the decision that would define the rest of the morning, and in some sense the rest of his life. He is said to have told the officers around him simply that they would not be going back to correct the mistake. Whatever ground lay ahead of them was now the objective. "We will start the war from right here," he reportedly said, and turned to face the dunes as though the sentence itself had settled the matter. It had not, of course, settled anything. It had only begun it. What Roosevelt could not have known in that moment, standing on sand that was never supposed to be his objective, was that the accident of the current had handed him an advantage no map could have provided. The stretch of coastline he now found himself attacking was defended more lightly than the beach 3 months of planning had targeted. A single powerful gun position, positioned to sweep the water with artillery fire, stood as the most significant obstacle in his path. Engineers and infantry worked together to silence it within the first hour, and the German soldiers manning it, exhausted, undersupplied. Many of them older reservists who had spent years defending a stretch of coast nobody in Berlin believed would ever be seriously tested, surrendered rather than die defending a position that had already been overrun on both flanks. They were not the elite panzer grenadiers of German propaganda. They belonged to a division that had been quietly hollowed out over 3 years of war, its healthiest and most capable soldiers siphoned east to feed a losing battle against the Soviet Union, replaced piece by piece. with men. The German army no longer trusted with anything more demanding than static coastal defense. Entire battalions along this stretch of the peninsula were filled not with Germans at all, but with conscripted soldiers from the Soviet Union's western territories, men who had been captured as prisoners of war and given an impossible choice between fighting for the army that had invaded their homeland or slowly dying behind barbed wire. Their loyalty to the beach they were being asked to defend that morning was, for reasons that needed no explanation, thin. None of this made the fighting bloodless. Men died on both sides in the minutes it took to clear that single strong point. Young Americans who had trained for this moment for over a year and never lived to see the causeway beyond it. Older German conscripts who had been told for months that an invasion here was unlikely and who found themselves, with almost no warning, defending a beach against thousands of men pouring out of the sea. War does not offer easy positions, even the relatively fortunate ones. It only offers positions that are less lethal than the alternative would have been. Hours earlier, in the darkness that had come before that same morning, a very different and much crueler version of the invasion had already been unfolding several miles behind, where Roosevelt now stood, among men who had jumped out of the sky long before the first landing craft ever touched the water. The paratroopers of the 82nd and 101st Airborne had gone in the night before, dropped into darkness, meant to secure the roads and bridges that would let the men landing on the beach actually move inland once they got there. It had not gone as planned. Cloud cover scattered the formations. Anti-aircraft fire forced pilots into evasive maneuvers that threw entire plane loads of men miles from their intended drop zones, and by the time the sun came up, thousands of American paratroopers were scattered across the flooded farmland of the Cotentin Peninsula in small, disconnected groups, uncertain of their exact location, fighting isolated skirmishes against an enemy they could not see coming. In the small crossroads town of Sainte-Mère-Église, paratroopers of the 3rd Battalion, 505th Parachute Infantry Regiment, carried out exactly what their orders called for, seizing the town and its vital road junction in the early hours of the morning, making it the first town in France to be liberated in the entire invasion, hours before a single man had come ashore on any beach at all. Not every man who dropped that night landed where he could fight. One trooper of the 505th, a private named John Steele, drifted down directly over the town square in the middle of the firefight and found his parachute snagged on the spire of the church, leaving him hanging helplessly above the battle below. He played dead through the sound of gunfire and burning buildings until he was finally cut down and taken prisoner. His ordeal, absurd and terrifying in equal measure, would become one of the most retold images of the entire invasion, a reminder that courage that night often had less to do with anyone's plan than with surviving an accident of geography. Among the men who never made it out of the sky intact was a young platoon leader from the 508th Parachute Infantry Regiment named Robert Matthias. Standing in the open door of his aircraft just after 2 in the morning, waiting for the signal to jump, he was struck by a burst of German flak that tore into his chest and knocked him to the floor of the plane. By any reasonable measure, his part in the invasion should have ended there, on the floor of a shaking aircraft, bleeding, alone. It did not. Survivors from his platoon would later describe watching him pull himself back up, using nothing but the strength left in his arms, raise his hand toward the men behind him, and jump anyway, calling out for them to follow. He was found afterward on the ground of Normandy, still connected to his parachute, the first American officer killed by enemy fire on the longest day of the war. His death, and the deaths of hundreds of other paratroopers, scattered and cut off in the darkness that morning, bought something that the men landing safely on Utah Beach hours later would never fully be able to calculate. Every German soldier pulled toward a firefight against a handful of lost paratroopers. 3 miles inland was a soldier not standing on the beach when Roosevelt's men came ashore. Every hour German commanders spent trying to determine where the real threat actually was. The beach, or the scattered fighting behind it, was an hour the invasion used to dig in deeper. The cost of that confusion was not paid evenly. It never is. The men fighting on Utah Beach that morning would suffer some of the lightest casualties of the entire invasion. The paratroopers who had jumped into the darkness ahead of them, alone, scattered, and often surrounded, would pay a price several times higher, in blood spent to buy time and confusion the men on the beach would never directly witness. Behind German lines, the confusion Roosevelt and the scattered airborne troops were creating was compounding into something close to institutional paralysis. Lieutenant General Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben, commanding the division responsible for this stretch of coastline, was trying to piece together a coherent picture of the battle with almost none of the resources that picture required. His most experienced superior, Field Marshal Rommel, was still hundreds of miles away in Germany, having left the front convinced no invasion could plausibly occur in weather this poor. Several of the senior officers who understood this exact stretch of coastline best were still on the road toward Rennes for that same exercise when the first reports of paratroopers began reaching their headquarters. Recall orders went out and the officers turned back, but the morning was already well underway by the time they reached their command posts. Reports reaching German headquarters that morning were fragmented and contradictory. Some described a full-scale invasion. Others described what sounded more like a large-scale raid, the kind of operation the Germans had weathered before at Dieppe 2 years earlier. High command in Berlin, and Adolf Hitler personally, remained convinced that the true invasion, when it came, would strike much further north, at the narrow crossing near Calais, where German intelligence still believed the bulk of Allied forces in England were massed and waiting, fed for months by the Phantom Army Group the Allies had built out of rubber tanks and false radio traffic. Nothing happening on a beach called Utah, as far as anyone in Berlin yet understood, was enough to change that belief. The paralysis went further up the chain than confusion alone could explain. Germany's armoured strength that morning was split under a divided command that Rommel himself had never wanted. The 21st Panzer Division, stationed close to Cannes, belonged to Rommel's own Army Group B and needed no permission from Berlin to move, and it did move, driving toward the coast that afternoon and briefly threatening to split the British and Canadian beachheads apart before it was fought to a halt. But the stronger reserves, the 12th SS Panzer Division and Panzer Lehr, sat further inland under a separate command structure that answered directly to Hitler's headquarters, and releasing them required an authorization that did not come quickly. Whether that delay was caused by aides reluctant to wake a sleeping Führer, by simple bureaucratic caution, or by the same overriding belief that Calais remained the true target, the effect was the same. Hours passed. By the time the strongest German armour was finally committed, the window in which it might have mattered most on the Cotentin side of the invasion had already closed. No single cause decided the fate of Utah Beach that morning. Rommel's absence and the confusion at German headquarters were part of it, but so were a hollowed-out, static division that had little fight left in it, an Allied deception campaign that kept German eyes fixed on Calais for weeks, and an overwhelming umbrella of Allied air and naval power that made moving any large German force in daylight a gamble few commanders were willing to take. It was the accumulation of all of it, not any one empty chair or any one signature, that let a beachhead born from a navigational mistake hold through that first, most dangerous day. On the beach itself, none of that context was visible to the men fighting through it. All Roosevelt could see was the ground directly in front of him, the causeways leading off the sand toward the flooded fields beyond, and the steady, grinding work of clearing a path for the tens of thousands of men still waiting offshore to come ashore behind him. He did not stop moving. Soldiers who fought alongside him that morning remembered a man who seemed to be everywhere at once, directing traffic at choke points where landing craft were beginning to back up against each other, personally waving trucks and tanks toward the routes that had already been cleared, exposing himself again and again to gunfire that had already killed men standing only a few feet away from him. He carried his walking stick the entire time, refusing every offer of a jeep, insisting on staying on his feet where the soldiers around him could see him. What almost none of those soldiers could see, hidden beneath the calm and the jokes and the poetry he kept quoting to steady the men around him, was what the exertion was doing to a heart that had already been damaged once, years earlier, in ways his doctors had explicitly warned him about. There were moments that morning, brief and private, when his chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with fear and everything to do with a body reaching the outer edge of what it could survive. He said nothing about it. He kept walking. Whatever warning his own body was sending him, it was a message he had decided, long before that morning, not to listen to. By mid-morning, word reached the beach that Major General Raymond Barton, commander of the 4th Infantry Division, had come ashore. When Barton finally found him, moving between positions near one of the causeway exits, walking stick in hand, voice hoarse from shouting directions over the noise of battle, but unmistakably alive, something in the older commander's posture visibly eased. Roosevelt had landed with the first wave, Barton would later say, had put the troops across the beach, and had a perfect picture of the entire situation. It was coming from a man who had genuinely feared he might find his friend dead in the sand, as close to relief as a battlefield commander allowed himself to show. Within roughly 3 hours of the first landing craft touching sand, the routes leading off Utah Beach had been secured well enough to allow the invasion to begin doing what it had come to do. Trucks began rolling off the beach in growing numbers. Tanks pushed forward along cleared paths toward the flooded farmland beyond. Thousands of men who had spent the crossing seasick and terrified now found themselves walking onto French soil relatively unopposed, following a route that had been paid for, in ways most of them would never fully understand, by an accident of current, a decision made by an aging general with a walking stick, and the blood of paratroopers scattered miles inland in the darkness the night before. It was, by any honest measure, one of the more fortunate mornings in the entire history of amphibious warfare. It did not feel fortunate to the men living through it. It rarely does. Somewhere behind the beach, German resistance was already regrouping, preparing to make the Americans fight for every mile between the coast and the port city of Cherbourg, still 35 miles to the north. Somewhere inside Roosevelt's chest, a heart that had already been pushed further than any doctor would have allowed was continuing to carry him forward through a battle that was, for him personally, very far from over. He did not yet know how little time that heart had left. The 3 hours it took to open the causeways off Utah Beach were only the beginning of what the 4th Infantry Division would face that summer. Beyond the dunes lay flooded farmland, hedgerows thick enough to hide an entire company, and 35 miles of increasingly determined German resistance standing between the beachhead and the port city everyone needed. Roosevelt did not slow down when the beach was declared secure. He kept moving with the advance in the days that followed, still on foot, still leaning on the same walking stick, still refusing every suggestion that he step back and let younger officers absorb the risk that came with staying at the front. By the time the fighting on Utah Beach itself had quieted enough to count the cost, the numbers told a story that was, by the standards of that morning, almost unbelievable. Roughly 21,000 American soldiers had crossed that beach on the 6th of June. Fewer than 200 of them had become casualties doing it. Set against what was happening at the same hour, only a few miles to the east, at a beach called Omaha, where thousands of men would fall in a single morning against defenses far heavier than anything Roosevelt's division encountered, the difference was almost impossible to reconcile. But that number, low as it was, told only part of what Utah Beach had actually cost. The paratroopers who jumped into the darkness hours before the first landing craft touched sand paid a price several times higher than the men who followed them onto the beach. Roughly 2,500 of them became casualties in the chaos of that scattered, isolated fighting across the flooded fields of the Cotentin Peninsula, men who never saw the beach at all, who fought and sometimes died in small groups, far from anyone who could help them, buying with their own blood the confusion that let Roosevelt's men come ashore so lightly by comparison. Several hundred more were lost among the engineers clearing the beach, the tank crews supporting the advance, and the sailors aboard vessels sunk trying to get everyone there in the first place. How many German soldiers died defending that stretch of coastline that morning was never precisely recorded. Records from a division that would cease to exist within weeks are not the kind of thing anyone stops to count in the middle of losing. By the end of that single day, all 5 invasion beaches had been secured, though at wildly different costs. What happened at Omaha alone would leave scars on American memory that outlasted the war itself. A few miles further along the same coast, at the base of the 100-foot cliffs of Pointe du Hoc, 225 Army Rangers had spent that same morning scaling rope ladders under direct fire to destroy a battery of coastal guns, only to discover when they reached the top that the guns had already been moved. They found them anyway, in an orchard half a mile inland, destroyed them before the Germans could bring them back into action, and then held the position for 2 days against repeated counterattacks, until reinforcements finally reached them, more than half their number killed or wounded in the process. To the east, British and Canadian troops fighting ashore at Gold, Juno, and Sword faced their own version of that same arithmetic. Several thousand casualties spread across the 3 beaches combined, submerged obstacles and unexpected currents of their own, and by nightfall a push inland toward the city of Cannes that would take far longer than any planner in London had allowed for. Utah Beach, by contrast, would be remembered, when it was remembered at all, as the fortunate one, the beach where things had somehow gone right. It is a comfortable story. It is not the whole story. It rarely is. The fighting that followed Utah Beach was neither quick nor merciful. The Norman countryside beyond the beach was a maze of small fields bounded by ancient earthen banks topped with thick hedges, a landscape farmers had shaped over centuries without ever imagining it would become a battlefield. American tanks that had crossed an ocean to fight found themselves nearly useless in lanes barely wide enough to pass through, exposed at every turn to German gunners dug into the banks ahead, and it would take weeks of grinding, hedgerow by hedgerow combat before the countryside finally opened up enough for the war of movement the invasion planners had originally imagined. German defenders under Lieutenant General Karl Wilhelm von Schlieben fell back through the peninsula toward Cherbourg, contesting nearly every field and hedgerow along the way, buying time for a harbour that Berlin had designated a fortress to be held at any cost. Field Marshal Rommel, having rushed back from Germany the moment word reached him of the invasion, arrived at his headquarters on the night of June 6th to find a battle already well beyond his ability to reverse. He would spend the following weeks trying to stabilize a front that never fully stabilized, until an Allied fighter plane strafed his staff car on the 17th of July, badly wounding him. 3 days later, a separate plot to assassinate Adolf Hitler failed inside a conference room, hundreds of miles away, a plan Rommel had known of only at the edges. It would take months for the investigation that followed to reach him. Not until the 14th of October, while he was still recovering at home, did officers arrive to tell him what the regime had decided. He was offered a choice between a public trial that would end in his execution and destroy his family's standing, or a quiet death by poison that would be reported to the public as a death from his wounds. He chose the poison. The general who had once boasted the invasion would be destroyed in its first 24 hours, was dead by his own government's order, having survived the invasion itself by little more than 4 months. Schliebben's fate was less dramatic and in its own way more merciful. Trapped inside Cherbourg with the remnants of his division, he surrendered the city to American forces on the 26th of June, becoming one of the highest-ranking German prisoners captured in the campaign so far. The Germans had wrecked the harbour facilities before giving them up, ensuring that even in defeat they could deny the Allies full use of the port for months to come. It was a small, bitter victory salvaged from a battle that had already been lost weeks earlier in the sand on the morning of June 6th. Barton himself would carry the division through the rest of 1944 from the hedgerows of Normandy and the liberation of Paris in August into the dense, freezing forests of the Hurtgen and the opening days of the Battle of the Bulge that winter. The cost of that leadership caught up with him too, though far less suddenly than it had with his friend. On the 27th of December, after 204 days of continuous combat, his own health had broken down under the strain, and he was quietly relieved of command and sent home, months before the war in Europe finally ended. A slower, less cinematic version of the same price the war seemed determined to collect from the men who refused to leave the front. Through all of this, Roosevelt stayed with his division. Soldiers who served alongside him in the weeks after the landing remembered a man who seemed, if anything, to grow more determined as the physical toll of the campaign mounted around him. He continued walking the front lines with his stick. He continued sharing poetry and jokes with exhausted men who badly needed the reminder that someone above them still saw them as people rather than numbers on a map. He wrote to his wife during those weeks that his presence on the line, stick and all, seemed to steady the younger soldiers around him more than any order he could have given. What almost none of them knew was how much that continued presence was costing him personally, how many quiet moments of chest pain he was absorbing without complaint, how deliberately he was choosing, every single day, not to say the words that might have gotten him pulled from the front and sent somewhere safer to recover. General Bradley had already recommended him for the Distinguished Service Cross, one of the Army's highest honors for gallantry, based on what he had witnessed and heard about that first morning on Utah Beach. It was at the time expected to be the final word on the matter. General George Patton, serving nearby, would later write to his own wife that Roosevelt was one of the bravest men he had ever known, a rare compliment from a man not known for handing them out freely. On the 12th of July, a little over a month after the landing, Roosevelt spent part of the day at the front with his men before returning that evening to his headquarters, a captured German truck converted into a sleeping quarters near the village of Miotis. There, he was surprised and delighted to find his son waiting for him. This was not the younger brother buried decades earlier in the First World War. This was Quentin Roosevelt II, 24 years old, a captain with the 1st Infantry Division, named after the uncle he had never met, who had come through his own share of fighting on Omaha Beach and the days that followed. Father and son sat together that evening, and in the quiet of that conversation, Roosevelt confided something he had told almost no one else in the army, that he had been feeling strange, recurring pains for days, pains he had kept hidden from the doctors and hidden from his own wife. That night, resting at last after 5 weeks, that had never once allowed him to fully rest, Theodore Roosevelt Jr. died in his sleep of a heart attack. He was 56 years old. He never learned that, at almost exactly the same hour, back at Allied headquarters, General Eisenhower had formally approved Bradley's recommendation to promote him to Major General. The promotion had been finalized on paper the very day his heart finally gave out under the weight of everything he had refused to let it rest from, since the moment the ramp of his landing craft dropped into the surf at Utah Beach. Word of his death traveled quickly through the division, and then across the radio waves back home, where broadcasters told listeners simply that he had died as he would have wished, in the service of his country. His funeral was held 2 days later, on Bastille Day, in a temporary military cemetery near Sainte-Mère-Église, the very town the paratroopers had liberated hours before he ever came ashore. He was buried initially there, not far from the beach he had helped secure. His grave would later be moved to the Normandy American Cemetery, overlooking the coastline, placed beside the grave of his own younger brother, a different Quentin, the pilot who had been shot down and killed, flying over France during the First World War, a full 26 years earlier. 2 brothers from the same family, killed in 2 different wars a generation apart, resting together on the same French hillside, within sight of the water that had carried so many other young men to the same fate. In the weeks after his death, the recommendation for the Distinguished Service Cross was reconsidered and upgraded to the Medal of Honor, the highest award the United States can give for valor in combat. His official citation described a general who, though the enemy held the beach under constant direct fire, moved from one position to another, rallying men, personally leading them forward, and through what the citation called his seasoned, precise, and unfaltering leadership, allowed his division to reduce the German strongpoints and push inland with minimum casualties, contributing substantially to the successful establishment of the beachhead in France. His widow, Eleanor, accepted the medal on his behalf. Nearly 2 decades later, Hollywood told its own version of that morning, in a black-and-white film, watched by millions of Americans who had lived through the war themselves, with the actor Henry Fonda playing the general with the cane. Fonda's performance left out the chest pains Roosevelt had hidden from his own doctors and the letters he had written, reassuring a wife who already knew better. The real man had never needed the embellishment. Years later, when Bradley was asked to name the single most courageous act he had known of in the entire war, a war that had by then produced no shortage of candidates, he did not describe a young infantryman charging a machine gun nest, or a pilot pressing home an attack through flak. He named an aging general with a bad heart and a walking stick. Bradley himself had spent that morning aboard the cruiser Augusta, watching the invasion unfold through reports and radio traffic, rather than standing on the sand himself, which made his judgment, in its way, even more striking. Of everything relayed to him that day, From 5 beaches and 2 airborne divisions, it was the account of a man who had asked 3 times to be allowed to go ashore first that stayed with him. 11 months and 1 day after the landings at Normandy, Germany surrendered, and the war in Europe came to its end. The beachhead that began with a mistake in the current, an old man's stubbornness, and a division of exhausted, poorly equipped defenders who never truly believed the invasion would come where it did, had by then become the foundation for the liberation of an entire continent. Quentin outlived his father by only a few years. He remained in the army through the rest of the war, went on afterward to a career in international aviation business, and was killed in a plane crash off the coast of Hong Kong in December of 1948, at the age of 29. Of the Roosevelt sons who went to war across 2 generations, the family's losses did not end on the beaches of Normandy. It is tempting, looking back from the comfort of everything that came after, to treat the story of Utah Beach as simple, almost gentle by the standards of that terrible day. Not gentle. It only looked that way from a distance, the way most fortunate mornings in war eventually do, once the men who actually lived through them are no longer alive to correct the record. What if the current had pushed those landing craft somewhere heavier defended instead? What if Barton had refused Roosevelt a 4th time, and no old man with a walking stick had been standing on that beach to make the call that turned a navigational disaster into an advantage? What if Stagg had been wrong about the weather, and the invasion had gone ahead a day earlier, into the storm, exactly as some of the officers in that room had wanted? What if Rommel had never gone home for his wife's birthday, and the armoured reserves he had begged Hitler to position closer to the coast had been released hours sooner, instead of scattered under a divided command that took most of the morning to sort itself out? History rarely offers clean answers to questions like that. It only offers what actually happened, which is, in its own way, stranger and more fragile than anything easily invented. It was not one decision, or one absence, or one accident of current that made the difference on Utah Beach that morning, but the way all of them arrived at once, unplanned, unrepeatable, and were met by a man who had spent his entire adult life training himself not to hesitate when it mattered most. A man in his 6th decade, walking through machine-gun fire on a beach that was never supposed to be his objective, telling the frightened soldiers around him that they would simply start the war from right there, because turning back was never really an option his life had prepared him to consider. Today, visitors who walk the rows of white crosses at the Normandy American Cemetery, overlooking the very water Roosevelt crossed that morning, often pause at one grave in particular, set slightly apart, marking not a young man cut down in his first battle, but an old man who had spent nearly 3 decades since his first war trying to prove he still deserved a place in the next one. Beside him lies the brother he lost long before any of this began. None of what followed belonged to him alone. Cherbourg fell to engineers and infantry, fighting hedgerow by hedgerow for 3 more weeks. The liberation of Europe belonged to 5 beaches, 2 airborne divisions, and the vast machinery of Allied air and naval power working together, not to one man on one strip of sand. But for the 4th Infantry Division, on the morning of June the 6th, for the 21,000 men who crossed Utah Beach behind him, the difference between chaos and an orderly advance traced back to those 60 seconds on a stretch of coastline that was not on anyone's map, and to a decision made not by the plan, but by the man who refused to wait for one.